Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us from across Canada and the globe. I'm Hannah Storm and I'm joining you from the UK. I'll be co-emceeing this event with Yolande James. This is the first of two virtual conversations. We're coming together to discuss the critical issue of online harassment of journalists and other professionals in our industry. Today we'll discuss the extent and forms of this threat, whereas next Tuesday we'll go over the results of an industry-wide Ipsos survey and look at the results of that in Canada. As we begin, I'd like to remind you that this event will be bilingual with simultaneous translation available. These sessions are recorded for our colleagues who are not able to join us live. Now, if I may introduce myself, I'm a media consultant specializing in journalism safety, be that online, physical, emotional, or digital. I'm the former director of the International News Safety Institute, and it's a real privilege to be with you here today. I've seen firsthand the rise in harassment and the impact it has had on the well-being of our colleagues and our industry, and I know many of you have seen the same. As devastating as this virtual violence is, we've also seen increased awareness and solidarity to counter this abuse, and this is something we wish to build on in this forum. So thank you again for joining us at this critical moment. And now, Yolande, over to you.
Merci beaucoup, Hannah.
Thank you very much, Anna. Hello, everybody. I am Yolande James. I am the Executive Director for Diversity and Inclusion at CBC Radio Canada, and I'm pleased to animate this forum with Anna from Montreal. I would like to acknowledge that the territory on which I stand are part of the Gagnon-Derrida territory, which is an indigenous unceded territory which has hosted people to meet throughout the ages. As this is an online event, I invite you to ponder where you are situated and how to advance the efforts of reconciliation with the First Nations, Inuits, and Métis everywhere in Canada. Since I'm in a position at CBC Radio Canada, I unfortunately notice the disproportionate harassment for online for women and misrepresented groups. This is reflected globally. This phenomenon shows that there's a deliberate will to silence certain voices. This is not okay. During this forum, we have sensitive topics that can echo your own experiences. If this is the case, do not hesitate to turn to someone you trust or to use the available resources within your organization. In Canada, you can also reach the Crisis Center Services of Canada. Thank you very much. Now, Catherine Tate, the CEO of CBC Radio Canada, has the floor.
Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Thank you, Hannah and Yolande, for your introduction and for agreeing to guide this important conversation. As Canada's public broadcaster, CBC Radio Canada has the unique responsibility to reflect all the diverse cultures, languages, and perspectives of Indigenous peoples and of all people in Canada. We do this by seeking to engage journalists from a wide range of backgrounds and perspectives. Unfortunately, as Yolande said, Indigenous, racialized, and LGBTQ2+ media professionals often face the greatest abuse for simply doing their jobs. We must protect all media professionals and their crews from harassment and violence. Des menaces en ligne,
online threats have offline consequences. We know some journalists, media personalities, and others leave the industry as a direct result of abuse. The fact that some media professionals leave the industry or even just self-censor because of online harassment means the diversity of perspective in our newsrooms is slowly eroded. The trolls are bad enough, but we also know that malicious coordinated groups aim to silence journalists through orchestrated disinformation campaigns. In a very real way, this abuse stemming from such campaigns threatens press freedom and undermines democracy.
This forum is part of a larger movement to protect media professionals from online violence. In Canada and around the world, we're seeing encouraging momentum to stop these attacks. Last month, the journalists Maria Ressa and Dmitry Muratov were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to safeguard freedom of expression. Also last month, 37 Canadian news media organizations came together to release a joint statement condemning online harassment of journalists. And earlier this fall, more than 40 public broadcasters and media organizations from around the world signed the Brussels Declaration demonstrating their commitment to supporting media professionals' safety and freedom of the press. Our forum is situated in the context of this truly global movement, and it is part of the ongoing work to combat online harassment that will continue beyond November 9th. CBC Radio-Canada is committed to working with other media to raise awareness of the issue, and most urgently, to propose concrete steps to reduce it. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight, but we must do more to protect journalists. Enough is enough. We must act together for a safer, stronger media. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Before we introduce you to our first panelist, I'd like to call your attention to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We invite you to share your feedback, thoughts, and questions throughout the event. Moderators will keep a close eye on it throughout the forum and will share the information with me and with Yolande. So let's begin. Joining us now are Dr. Julie Posetti, Global Director of Research for the International Center for Journalists, and David Kaye, Professor of Law at the University of California, Irvine, and the former Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression. Thank you so much both for joining us. You are both two experts in this field, and it's such a privilege to have you as part of this conversation. I'd like to begin with you, Julie, and I'd like to talk a little bit about this global study that you've been recently leading, the Chilling, on the online violence against women journalists. You're going to run us through some of the findings from that study.
I am, and I'm going to attempt to share my screen, Hannah and colleagues, so bear with me please while I do that. And the reason for sharing my screen is to ensure that I can provide some data to underpin what I'm saying. And I think data is one of the more powerful things we have in our kit to combat online violence against women journalists. It's hard to argue with facts and statistics. And I want to echo what was just said about the Nobel Peace Prize being awarded for acts of journalism in this past few weeks. One of the recipients was Maria Ressa, who has actually been at the forefront of attempts to call out and combat gender-based online violence against journalists from the Philippines. In fact, her work in trying to hold powerful tech companies to account and to call out these attacks is featured in the description of the justification for her award. And here's a comment that she made after receiving news of being a Nobel laureate, and that is to say that what she has experienced in the Philippines is a stark example of a global trend. So what I'm going to share with you is some data from a global study I've been leading for the International Center for Journalists and UNESCO, looking at the scale, intensity, and spread of this scourge. So we did a survey of around 715 women journalists from around the world. A very diverse range of countries were represented. And we found that of those 715 odd women journalists who responded, 73% said that they had experienced online violence in the course of their work. And we deliberately chose to use the term online violence to highlight the fact that these acts, these threats of sexualized violence, these threats of murder, horrible instances of harassment, coming in various forms, and you can see some of the examples there on the screen, from hateful messages that are received in a public domain through to attempts to target journalists through direct messages, for example, where perpetrators can act with relative impunity. And so it was important to highlight that this is a very widespread problem. It's a genuinely global problem. And we studied 15 countries around the world to demonstrate the ways in which this manifests. But it's a problem that is misogynistic at its core, but one which is exponentially worse at the intersection of other forms of discrimination and hate. So we found, for example, that while white women journalists were targeted at the rate of 64% of participants, Black women journalists, Indigenous women journalists, Jewish women journalists, and women of different sexual orientation were much more likely to experience online violence than the white straight women journalists in our data set. So it's at this nexus of religious bigotry and race-based hate that the impacts and the incidents of online violence tend to be most severe. We also found that the impacts were pretty universal. Women around the world highlighted mental health impacts as the most significant of their experiences. Around 26% of respondents said that that was the #1 impact. It's also important to note that in answer to another question, 30% said that they self-censored in response to online violence. And we found other evidence that women are withdrawing from public spaces, even asking for their bylines to be removed from stories, handing stories off to other journalists to avoid the attacks that they know will follow, asking to be removed from on-air roles. This demonstrates what a serious threat to freedom of expression this problem is. And one of the most significant risks is the potential for online attacks to escalate into offline violence. So we found 20% of our survey respondents said they had been abused or attacked offline, that is in the physical world, in connection with online violence. And that came in a variety of forms, from physical assault through to legal harassment, orchestrated, state-linked legal harassment campaigns, which are very much real experiences of digital violence. Again, though, this wasn't uniform. So among our respondents who were identifying themselves as Arab, 53%, over half, said that they had experienced this phenomenon of escalation of online violence into the offline space. It also works both ways. So when we see politicians, for example, calling out women journalists, abusing them, in a press conference scenario, for example, we see the online pylons escalate in response, and then that spills back offline potentially. Here is a detail of a case study that we did on Marie Arrest. So we examined 500,000 posts on Facebook and Twitter over a period of 5 years. And we found that she suffered the most intense misogynistic abuse, often racialized. She was frequently portrayed as a monkey. Her sexuality was critiqued. She was the subject of a whole range of personalized abuse, but overwhelmingly, the abuse that she suffered, about 60% of it, was designed to chill her journalism, to undercut public trust in her reporting. And you can see from this word cloud that while the misogynistic and racist hate swirled, it often swirled in combination with accusations that she was a liar. So disinformation tactics to portray her as a fake news purveyor were part of the suite of the problems that she experienced. And we found that 41% of our survey respondents had experienced online violence in connection with orchestrated disinformation campaigns. And I'll leave it there, Hannah, just to give you some context for this discussion on a global scale.
Thank you, Julie. And so many facts there, so striking and so chilling, as you say. I'm really grateful, Julie, to you for sharing that, and wish you a lot of luck in the continued work that you're doing, the really important work. David, I just want to pick up on that last slide of Julie's, talking about disinformation. We know that lots of narratives are being seeded against journalists to try to not only undermine the individual journalist, but our industry at large. And that's having a negative impact on freedom of expression, on democracy as well. How do you see that playing out in the world?
Yeah, Hannah, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. And thanks especially to Julie for all of her work, not just the work that we've just seen today, this morning here in California, but over the last many years. Really, Julie, you're a leader in this space. One of the things that I would start by highlighting is the human rights principles that are at issue here, right? So Julie mentioned this in the last slide, right? The purpose of so much of the misogyny and harassment online and offline is designed to push women off platforms, to push journalism off platforms, to silence and intimidate voices. This isn't random harassment. This is harassment that has a real design at its heart. And when you think about the nature of freedom of expression, right? The right to freedom of expression as codified in international human rights law, it's a protection and a guarantee of freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers and through any media. And I want to just focus for a moment on that seek, receive, and impart part of the equation. Because when you think about what misogyny and other online violence and harassment is doing, it is not merely, although this is the most direct impact, not merely directed at particular individuals, right? It is also directed at all of our right to seek and receive information. And when we think about online harms like this in that way, I think it allows us to see not just the individual harm caused by this kind of misogyny and attack, but we also see the social, the public harm, the harm to public participation, to governance, to our ability to maintain democratic institutions and free and fair public debate. And so I think framing the issue only as an attack on specific individuals, as detestable as that is, I think misses the broader perspective. And I think this is the perspective that Julie's research is leading us towards, which is this is a public harm that needs to be dealt with. Now, the kinds of harms that we face need to be dealt with in an appropriate way. And we can talk a little bit about that, but I think the research really highlights the threat to freedom of expression that is essential to public debate and our access to information.
Thank you, David. I'd just like to press you a bit further. How do we balance the challenges, I suppose, of protecting and promoting freedom of expression with this need to regulate online harm and online violence, to end that in some ways, in some shape or form? So how do we find that kind of balance? And the other question I'd like to pose to you both at the moment is that we've come together today to have a global but Canada-based conversation about what we can do to recognize this, what we can do together to try to counter this. So before we close, I would like to ask you for your suggestions in terms of practical things that people might be considering, either in their newsrooms or individually or legislatively wise, for people to kind of how we can counter this together. But back to the question about how do we balance that need to protect and promote freedom of expression, but also to regulate online harm?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and it's a thorny one, right? Solutions can be very difficult. I think we need to be honest about that. I think one thing to recognize, and this is particularly evident in the case of Maria Ressa is how coordinated the attacks on some journalists, not all journalists, but on some journalists may be. You know, the situation in the Philippines has been that Maria Ressa has been subject to assault in a way that has been not only directed at the highest levels of government by the Duterte government, but also through hints and other forms of coordination have been sort of directed at her and her team at Rappler in order to silence their voices, to silence their reporting, to silence the kind of criticism that might come from their reporting. So, you know, a first step is to kind of name and identify sources of harm. And I think that's one thing that we've seen. But I think also we have to recognize that so much of this, you know, this environment of attack is taking place in online forums, on online platforms. And it's taken the platforms, the biggest platforms, I think many years to realize that misogynistic attacks and hate speech, other forms of attacks, are not merely some kind of speech that they should, you know, let happen because of this, you know, the sacred quality of expression. You know, it's taken them a while, although I think they are getting to a point where they understand that attacks like this are also threats to everyone's right to freedom of expression. And when they see it that way, it allows them at least to start to take steps to limit the attacks, while at the same time doing it in a way that you're suggesting is the core problem, which is how do you do that in a proportionate way? In other words, how do you deal with the attacks and create rules and policies to deal with those attacks while not silencing those who are raising concerns about those attacks, who are using terms and other forms of speech in order to create solidarity? How do you create that space for sharing of information and creating solidarity while at the same time dealing with the misogyny? It sounds like an easy problem to solve, right? If there's misogyny, just shut it down, silence it. But all too often that leads to the companies over-regulating and actually taking down content from the very people who are the victims of these assaults. And that's the area where we need to be working. And so I think this does require, as a first measure, companies being transparent about their rules, companies engaging in a very real, robust way with stakeholders, that is journalists, with groups that are dedicated to promoting voices of those who are either underrepresented or regularly subject to attack. And it requires, I think, working with other stakeholders, including with government, to identify the mechanisms for oversight that don't involve government in deciding what's legitimate and what's illegitimate content or speech in the public square.
Thanks, David. I'm going to come back to you in a moment about what those mechanisms for accountability might look like. But Julie, I want to come back to you because you talk about network misogyny, and you also talk significantly, and it's something that I know from my own work in journalism safety, how frequently in gendered violence people are blamed for the things that happen to them. And you talk about this in online harassment terms. How can we work to counter that, given this victim blaming that's taken place, if we want to use the term victim, of course, and this kind of network misogyny? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts go like this, that women journalists have been forced to bear the brunt of responding to the attacks that they endure, just as women's behavior is policed in reference to physical and sexual assault, domestic violence. The same has been true with regards to online violence against women journalists. So the onus has been on them to respond, to change their behavior, to block, mute, delete. Many of these habits are part of the kit that we have to try to protect ourselves. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't try to protect ourselves, but the core of the problem, that is the design and the business models underpinning the platforms conduct in reference to online violence against women journalists must be dealt with. And that's how we've ended up in this thorny, gnarly discussion about regulation of the platforms with all of the risks to freedom of expression that entails. Today is the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. And I see online violence as a mode of aiding and abetting impunity. The platforms have acted with impunity with regard to dealing with the problem, to the extent that it was only a couple of weeks ago that Facebook acknowledged that they had perhaps erred in reference to the way they deal with threats of murder against journalists. So only a couple of weeks ago did they change their policy to prevent threats of murder against journalists on their platform. I think that highlights for us how difficult this situation is. What it means for journalists and news organizations, for the profession, is that we need to do what this event is trying to achieve, that is to facilitate solidarity and collaboration. That, of course, means that we need to use the tools of journalism, investigative reporting, to hold the platforms to account. And we're starting to see a real shift in that regard. A lot of attention now being placed on the failure of the platforms to deal with this problem effectively through self-regulation. But we also need political actors to take responsibility for their own behavior and to recognize the ways in which their conduct, when they demonize journalists, when they use misogynistic hate speech to try to chill critical reporting of their governments or their policies, that this places journalists' lives at risk, and especially women who are more vulnerable to other forms of offline attacks, sexual assault, for example. And just to go back to that data, 37% of our respondents in the survey said that they could identify political actors, so elected officials, spokespeople for political organizations, as perpetrators of online violence. So those, we need to put the emphasis on changing the behavior of the instigators and perpetrators, and at the same time demand accountability as well as transparency from the platforms, I think.
Thank you, Julie. And I'll come back to you again before we close about this idea of what news organizations can do to support people to be able to speak more openly about their experiences, because we do know that very few people who encounter this abuse feel safe to be able to speak openly about it. But David, to you, we spoke briefly before about mechanisms of accountability. What might they look like?
It's a really good question. I mean, there's different forms of accountability, right? I mean, there are the forms of accountability that we could demand of the platforms. So Julie was alluding to some of this kind of change in the rules at this extraordinarily, I mean, shockingly late date on some of these issues. I think one of the forms of accountability that you would get from transparency is a better idea of how the companies are dealing with these problems. And then sort of the next step would be the community of people like Julie, like others who are active in this space, to understand exactly how different kinds of attacks are coordinated and whether or not those individual networks and individuals are actually continually allowed to maintain their own space on the platforms. So one form of accountability is, taking down accounts that are responsible for attacks on journalists, right? That's in some respects, that's an easy, almost a kind of low-hanging fruit for the companies to do. And there needs to be more clarity about how they do that. Now, there's a very active debate worldwide, but including in countries like Canada, in the UK, in the United States, about when should the platforms be held liable? I mean, really, responsible for the harms that take place on their platforms. And that's, I think, a very complicated place to be thinking about accountability, but we do need to be thinking about it. I mean, my own view is that government regulation should start with essentially requiring the companies to be more open about their rules, about their algorithmic recommendation systems, how they enable certain kinds of attacks to go viral, to continue, that in itself could be a form of accountability, and that I think would be extremely embarrassing to many of the companies once you see exactly how this operates. I'm less sure that holding them directly accountable in the sense of requiring them to take certain steps to take down content at the risk of significant fines is going to be the solution that works for us. My concern there is that the companies will ultimately over-rotate in a way. They will end up taking down the kind of content that is actually supportive of journalists, of women, of underrepresented communities. We've seen this happen in places around the world. So it goes back to your original question about how do we find the balance? And for me, the first place is to kind of crack them open, make them more amenable to public scrutiny.
Thanks, David. And I don't know about anybody else on this conversation, as part of this conversation, but I think anybody who's had anything to do with the platforms will recognize the fact that they are not as transparent as they need to be. Julie, I remember us having a conversation, goodness, probably 6-7 years ago, about the need for solidarity in the industry and the idea that we were stronger together than we were as individual parts in terms of journalism organizations. So just in terms of kind of wrapping up this conversation, I'd love to hear your insights in terms of what specifically the news organizations can do to encourage people to feel safer, but then also what we as an industry can do. And you've done so much work on this already to just try to create solidarity to counter this abuse.
Just let me give you a couple more statistics because I think they're helpful from the research to shape this answer. So among our survey respondents, only 25% of the women journalists said they had reported episodes of online violence that they had experienced to their employers. I think that remains a really serious challenge for the profession. We know that journalism, especially news reporting, has typically been a male-dominated and unfortunately patriarchal and at times misogynistic place and space for women journalists. That needs to shift still. A lot of work needs to be done. It's brilliant that those participating in this event have clearly started to grapple with that problem and address it proactively. Among that 25% who did report the problem, 10% said their employers did nothing in response, and 9% said that they were told to grow a thicker skin, which gets back to this victim blaming problem. And I think we still have substantial work to do on that score. An alarming but small proportion of people, also women, also said they were asked specifically by their employers what they did to provoke the attacks. That points to a really big challenge, that is to ensure that women are not being blamed and they're not being made responsible for the attacks that they endure. And one of the key challenges that we've seen in this research and an area that we're calling for action on is actually to ensure that speech policing of women's online conduct, women journalists' online conduct, isn't used to try to address the problem. So women need to feel free to speak about their experiences and to share them publicly where they choose to, and to speak back to their attackers with all of the caveats around the need for general respectful behavior, and not to feel guilty or afraid of any kind of sanctions with regard to their employment being brought into play. And that's something that news organizations can do, and that this sort of event is hopefully encouraging. On top of that, just one final point. Unfortunately, we saw substantial evidence, particularly in Western contexts, of partisan news media and high-profile male journalists instigating and joining in the pylons on women journalists. That is something that is utterly intolerable. And at the same time as we're saying women journalists need to be given the liberty to speak back and to speak up, there needs to be a recognition that journalists perpetrating any form of hate speech is utterly unacceptable and counterproductive and needs to be dealt with. I think I'll leave it there for now, Hannah.
Thank you, Julie. And to your point, your final point, one of our hopes here is that we are making strides into normalizing the conversation, to normalizing the idea that online violence against journalists is completely unacceptable. It should not be part of our job. It is not part of our jobs. So we need to be able to speak out about that. And to both of you, thank you so much for such a wide-ranging, fantastic conversation. I could have sat and talked to you for the rest of the day. I know you're incredibly busy people. We're very grateful to you. Thank you so much again, David and Julie. We hope to hear more of you in the future and work with you again in the future as well. Yolande, back over to you.
Wow. Merci beaucoup, Hannah. Et c'était vraiment extraordinaire d'entendre la voix des panélistes, notamment.
It was wonderful to hear the panelists to talk about all the impact of the data. So I think they were all in agreement about the importance of acting and to, make concrete steps. And it's important to be there. So one of the objectives of the forum is to really understand the reality of the day-to-day work for those who are living this harassment. And so we will have the chance to hear the voices of the Canadian experience. I will now introduce you the participants of the first roundtable.
Tout d'abord, Joanna Chu, reporter at the Toronto Star, Omaira Issa, reporter at the CBC, Bouchroy Watik, reporter at National à la Radio-Canada, et Tristan Péloquin, journaliste à la presse. Welcome and thank you to all of you, all four of you, for being here. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So, I think I want to get started with you, Joanna, if I could, because I know that you've written quite a bit on the subject. And it's so important as we think about how we can work together to understand what your experiences are, all four of you. But I'll start with you, Joanna, if you can kind of just walk us through your experience. And I'd like to hear you specifically about at what moment in time did you realize, hold on a second here, this is not normal. This is not within the parameters of what is in my job description.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me in this really important forum. And I was just nodding along with everything that Julie and David said, because I'm so glad that this was said, and not just by journalists ourselves, but by experts, because that really helps lend credibility to our voices. Like the more validation of our experiences there can be, I think that is really helpful, because one of the problems is that it's really been up to often racialized women journalists of color to talk about our experiences. And I'm happy to do so, but in this space where we have allies who can back up what we're saying, that's so important. So your question, when did I realize this wasn't normal? So I was a correspondent in China for 7 years for international media outlets, and actually reporting from overseas to an international audience. Mostly I worked for European media. I didn't get as much of the harassment at the time, even though it was pretty high profile. I was reporting on just major events, sensitive events, including in China on human rights. It was actually when I returned to Canada that things got really bad. So I guess I can provide this outsider perspective where there might be something particular about our Canadian social media landscape that can get so nasty and so personal so quickly, and that I found particularly misogynist and racist. And that's something that, people might feel surprised about, because we have the stereotype of polite Canadians, but in fact, I've written for many countries' media, and going back home to Vancouver, it was just really ridiculous. And for the Toronto Star, starting in late 2018, I was managing a newsroom of 12 reporters, and actually most of us were people of color or came from immigrant families. I think half of us came from immigrant families. And it was really interesting because we'd often work together on stories, 2 or 3 bylines, sometimes 4 bylines. And it didn't really matter what topic it was. It could be something pretty innocuous about an environment, for example. And online harassment and the trolls would come after always the woman journalist, way more than the male journalist, even if they shared a byline, even if the man's byline happened to be the first one. So I think that was really eye-opening for many of the men in our newsroom, that they could do exactly the same job as their women and BIPOC colleagues. And while they would get praise or not much feedback, the woman, for some reason, would just get a storm of just toxic responses. Sometimes it would range from subtle, like people, trying to tell us how to do our jobs or kind of condescending, or it would get to where it would get really ugly, rape threats, death threats. That's things that we had to deal with as a newsroom. And for the last year and a half, I've been a national correspondent for Toronto Star, so focusing more on writing myself and focusing on covering the Canada-China relationship, as well as, Canada's place in the world more broadly, talking about, India, for example. So I realized that things were really bad when I realized I was putting together like a file for my editor of threats I've received in the past. And I actually came over death threats that I had forgotten about, months ago. So the fact that I forgot about receiving some of these and only, remembered when I put together these screenshots, because at the Toronto Star, we're trying to learn more about what's happening, and my editor asked me to look these up. I felt that was a problem, and we had a discussion about how I should at least go to the police to get the police to file a report. So I spent a lot of time compiling like these attacks on me. And I had a book out recently, China Unbound, which focuses on human rights and criticizes the Western response to China's human rights issues and political issues. And just before the release of that book, my online attackers not only attacked me, but they found the emails of only my female editors and publishers and sent them messages alleging that I was an ISIS terrorist, sending all sorts of strange pictures. So I found that was interesting, that they targeted not only me as a female journalist, but my female editors, not my male supervisors. That was really striking, like the gendered approach to all of this. Even when it has something to do with something that's not about gender, it's about, I write about geopolitics of China and Western relationships. So I did, that was kind of the last straw for me, that they weren't just going after me, but my colleagues trying to smear my reputation in addition to death threats. Someone said that I should get my neck ready because they were coming over to my house, to allege that they were kind of come behead me, which is, horrifying. I should have remembered that, but I had forgotten about it because I got such a torrent of these messages. So I reported these to police, and the police officer, was really nice. They said, this is terrible, this is happening to you, but they were really honest about what they can do in these situations. And the constable told me that judges are hesitant to allow police to access information about an online commenter's or emailer's IP address unless they think there's imminent threat to someone's safety. And I said, these are death threats. That's an imminent threat to my safety. But that, the police like, no, like the judge probably wouldn't take that. So they say, I asked, is there a unit focused on these attacks online? And police said the cybercrime unit is mostly focused on economic crime. So fraud, people trying to steal your money, not try to attack you or threaten to kill you online. And there's no basically specific department. I asked the Minister of Public Safety. Again, Julie was talking about using our journalistic skills to try to find out more, like what can people do? Because it's not only journalists who get these threats, it's people in all sorts of fields. I wrote a piece called in the Toronto Star, it was front page, titled, I've lost track of how many threats I've received. That's how common online hate is. And not only shared my own experience, but spoke with NGO workers, spoke with writers, spoke with professors of law, all experience similar things. And the Minister of Public Safety, Bill Blair, he said Canadians who experience this should go to the police. So it feels like it's really circular.
There's so much to unpack on what you've said, and I'll come back to you notably on the question of how that was a coping mechanism for you to just forget that, the depths of those threats. Mais je vais peut-être passer la parole à toi, Bouchra, pour nous parler.
Maybe I'll start speaking with Bouchra to see what your experience was. What is your experience with online bullying and harassment, and how you had to adapt your type of, how you worked? First of all, talk about your experience. Well, for me, since the beginning of the pandemic, it happened before the pandemic from some time when I would talk about a controversial subject, whether it was a hateful message, and often when we're a woman and a colored woman, there's a lot of misogynist messages. But when I was part of the Décrypteur team, because before the pandemic, we were looking at various anodyne, basically. So, but we had very few hateful messages. So we, with the producers, wanted to have a dialogue with the public. So we created a group where people were able to react to the articles that we wrote. But since January 2020, there was started been lab experiences, and I would say that 100% that of the subjects that we covered were linked to change pandemic-related lies, so that to the fact that the government created a virus, or that all the that there's a pedo-satanist Kabbalah of world leaders that are responsible for this. So we had a very violent responses to our denial. So people started creating that the general media were all sold to the elites, to the government, to Bill Gates, and that we were accomplices. So what I understand from their point of view, especially those that understood that there was a satanic elite, they saw us as accomplices of those who are attacking the children. So if I'm putting myself in the head of those people, we were seen as very evil people, and the hate that we were receiving did reflect that. So from that point, the dialogue with the public became almost impossible, because in the Facebook group that we had created that had about 40,000 people, there were so many hate messages that we had to close the comments because we can no longer moderate those. And we started seeing a lot of emails and a lot of social media messages that were hateful. And it really became threats that were pretty concrete. So a lot of people, not only me, but Jeff Yates, Alexis de Lancer, that were at that time, so in 2020, they were my colleagues at Décrypteur. We received messages that associated to the collabo after the World War II. So there were connotations. You know what happened at the collabo. Once that the pandemic will be finished and the truth will be seen, you will be eliminated. So sometimes the messages were, indirect threats, but sometimes it was very direct threats. So like they're going to hang us, for example. I know that one time we had to call our managers or directors of security, and they told us to contact police. So for me, it happened at least once where I had to contact police because there was one internet troll that was sending us repeated messages after an article that I said that why do we become conspirators? And these messages were so precise. They were threats that were very clear, and we knew that it was someone that lived in Montreal. So what's surprising is that the police intervened quite fast, because I know in the past, in terms of online threats, it wasn't always easy to make a complaint, and it wasn't always easy to be taken seriously when there's a email threat, for example. But here, the police intervened quite fast. So the investigator told me that that person was arrested, and there was a, date that the person had to appear before the court. After a few weeks, the charges were abandoned, but it was at least one person that became conscious that we can't do death threats without, with impunity. So I feel that a lot of people felt that wanted to throw all their frustration on the social media without consequences. I'm not the only journalist. I see it enormously. I know that other journalists show on their social media that they share the type of messages that they receive that are hateful messages. And so we're trying to denounce those types of messages. And some other people call on the police as well. Sometimes it's people that come from Europe and from France. What happened with COVID is that there's been a lot of conspiracy types of influencers that came here. So there was a lot of people in France. So a lot of French people knew Décrypteur and would write to us from France to send us hateful messages. Since we're publishing only in French, so all of the Francophone world would know what we were doing. So especially that a lot of influencers, conspirators, or conspiracy theorists, I should say, would say that that the Décrypteur would attack us again because we're saying the truth. So it's been actually a few months that were quite stressful. For me, right now, in the last year, I'm working with Découverte, so I no longer work there. So I don't have to manage all this. I'm not in the beat of this information. So I know that some of my colleagues that are still working in there find it very, very heavy. And it's unfortunate because it's people that like their work. They like to talk about it, but it's the price to pay inevitably and to receive, threats and insults. So for me, it was not only a question of receiving the direct violence, but it was especially the fear to be hacked, people that don't know where I live, people don't necessarily live in Montreal, but I started to worry about, in terms of security of my social media networks, some messages were saying that, okay, we're going to try to hack them. So now I was wondering, are my personal information will be found online? So I started to think about how I could protect myself online to avoid actually to be attacked in a cyber way. So we also have we were partners in Facebook of the program of fact verification in Facebook. So when there's a false information that there was a Décrypteur article that would be published with the person that shared information that it was false. And then we noticed that it would position us as targets because people would so people were noticing this information, our Décrypteur team, and it also, caused us to get, instead of reassure people, they seem to have an even greater belief that it was the misinformation. So yes, we had detractors. Yes, because people are sharing these, they believe it 100% to be told that media, that for us, media also already represents the enemy. To say that the media contradicts them, they don't believe it. So in fact, people didn't exactly understand the Facebook ecosystem works. So these warnings would appear automatically, but people had the impression that we would look at their particular profile and people said that I publish something for my kids only, and then you're making an article to say that it's false. But us through the Facebook system, Facebook recognizes some links and some information, and we just get that information. So sometimes we've had criticism in terms of how Facebook works. It wasn't very clear how it works. So instead of being angry against Facebook, people were angry against the media that was authoring the article that they saw published. They felt that we were scanning their profile, that we were attacking them on their personal, field. And so also it noticed that people that were not part of our target audience heard us, people talking about us. And so they said, hey, I'm sharing some information with my friends, and some media is telling me that it's false. So there was a lot of loss of confidence towards the media during the pandemic. And it became, for some people, as visceral hatred for all the media. Well, I'm understanding it's very clarifying. I see the link between Julie's presentation and the fact that your function in Décrypteur was to, show the fact from fiction. So it actually increased the balloon of anger and frustration. So it's interesting to see how you had to adjust how you would work.
Maybe to link to Myra to hear, COVID and Bushra was talking about it a few minutes ago, as also, in certain ways created the perfect storm where we're more online than we've ever been. Have you found, as you tell us about your own experience and when online hate, that has COVID made it worse, and how for you?
You know what, that's a really important question. I have to say that in my own experience, in the past, I would receive hate mail every once in a while. But recently, I've received a string of hateful messages that were particularly racist and sexist and anti-immigrant sentiment. And some of the messages were actually attacking my work very specifically. And so what Julie was saying about the research was very resonant with me, because it showed in the research how there is an intersection when it comes to the attacks that particularly women of color are receiving, and particularly Black women. And so as a Black journalist, I was receiving very, very targeted language. And what was particularly unsettling to me is the fact that historically, the messages that I was receiving, the language was not particularly violent. But in the most recent messages I was receiving, the language was particularly violent and particularly virulent, with some threats, some veiled threats towards me. And so that was very unsettling. And it signaled to me that something different is happening right now that wasn't happening before. And in terms of the impact on me, I'm going to be very candid here. It had a really serious impact on me because it was in many ways unsettling. And so what happened to me is that for a few days, it unsettled me. It kind of scared me, particularly because I was concerned about my physical safety, but I was also concerned about my online safety. Was I going to be doxxed? Was I going to be hacked? Was there going to be more of a targeted campaign against me? And so those were the concerns that I had. And I have to say that I realized in that moment that the goal was to unsettle me, the goal was to intimidate me. And it was at that moment when I realized that it was clear in my mind that I wasn't gonna let that happen, and that my work as a journalist, as a Canadian journalist in informing the Canadian public was way more important to me than caving to that kind of behavior.
I hear you.
Maybe I would like to now hear Tristan on your experience at La Presse. Is the COVID for you created a type of perfect storm? How did the situation evolve at your work? For me, I specialized during COVID for the coverage of the, in terms of conspiracy theorists. So I had a lot of attacks from Well, no, I did a lot of work on the conspiracy theorists and influencers, and I did a lot of work on them. And so I published some articles since the beginning of COVID. So this created a little bit of a accumulated a type of tension that was grossing. In November, two events occurred that were significant. One of the leaders on which I work wrote on some, legal problems that he had, and I don't think he liked my article. And I think he decided to publish my telephone number on Facebook. So it's a doxing type of form. So he published it, and Yves Poirier, PDA, and for Yves, it was a catastrophic. He received 100 telephone numbers in the telephone calls, and then the next hours giving him death threats, etc. I was less visible, so I was a little bit luckier because I was part of the written press. So I received some messages, some direct threats. Somebody wrote me, guy, it's vulgar, I'm sorry, but it's not easy to be in your shorts. You have to shit in your shorts because when you have leaving your home with images of bombs. So we start thinking when these things happen, we start looking right or left to see if somebody's going to attack us. If somebody, because a person put a bomb under my car, it makes you nervous. So it creates auto censure that's pretty major in our desire to. It's a big break, and I think that's what they want to do. I think that's the effect that they're trying to get, right? So for me and Yves, we decided to complain to the police, and the police took it very seriously. And a few hours later, they arrested that person. So this leader is an ex-police officer, so it's important to mention, and he was accused of harassment with IT. So it's always in tribunals. So I will not talk about it too much because it's negotiating right now. So he might, say that he's culpable. So I would just wanted to say that it's wonderful that the police took it seriously. My bosses took it seriously as well. They encouraged me to complain. So, and I think that was the right thing to do, but it had a negative effect as well. That means that justice imposed that he would have liberty conditions to not contact me, to not come close to me. For me, de facto, it makes it difficult to cover things. If he can't contact me and I can't contact him. So is he in a delicate position? So I think that it's part of the problem. And in the same period, I covered another conspiracy theorist, and he was really in a very conspirator type of mode. So he talked about the DPG is a network of kidnapping children, and it talked about pedophilic Satanist type of trend. So I started to focus on what he did in front of courts, like what his history is in the courts. He would have pseudo legal arguments in the courts. So he was very active to make charges against Horacio Arruda and François Legault to have them arrested. So he said that he can do, he knows jurisprudence and he can do, citizen arrests, etc. So I started being interested in that person, and I wanted to see in the courts what happens in courts. And after, when we left court and I started questioning them, that person started filming me live and to insulting me, and I was a shithole, and I was a whole bunch of things, and so there were 200, 300 people that were indirect that were following him. So those people, not only the conspiracy theorists, but people who don't like journalists will do it like they do it with the police officers. They will film live with the interactions that they have with the police officers or journalists. So this had an impact that was quite big. I was wondering, did I react properly? If a person that wants a confrontation, they're insulting you on the street. You're walking in the street and they're saying, "Oh, you're an asshole," and then people, you're turning around. And so I was wondering, everybody was telling me, you were very strong that you didn't hit him since it was so violent against you. And that really, started a type of there was a tidal wave of negative comments and messages that I received. So people even commented under the Halloween pictures of my children, saying, "Oh, it's a massive propaganda." Essentially, I continued, and it didn't stop me to continue covering the what was happening in the courts with that person, and he had a lot of debacles or setbacks in the courts, and he had a lot of criminal procedures against him. And finally, he was arrested because he didn't respect the instructions, the court's instructions. So he stayed in prison for 4 months. And quite quickly, he was saying in front of the judge that it was his fault, that he was trying to influence the Quebec bar, and he asked the judge to make orders to stop me from talking about him. I think that justice is pretty clairvoyant. It's not one judge that put an end to the liberty of the press, but we're seeing how quickly it becomes personal for those types of people, and they're using every means that they can. And that person had in their entourage, and the Farfadals, they're a radical group of conspiracy theorists. So that person would have this entourage that came around them, and they did a physical intimidation in the courts. They would do human barriers so that I wouldn't come into the courtrooms. And so authorities would intervene, but it starts, quickly becoming worse. So I'm seeing there's.
I understand how important this is and how heavy this is for you to carry. We still have a little bit of time. I will see some questions. Regarding the conversation you had with your boss and with the managers, how you were supported, we're going to see that in a bit. The other point, the loneliness and the effect on your mental health is.
I want to start with
really
you, Omaira, as you spoke to that point a few minutes ago.
These are really great questions. I'll start with the first one. I have to say that I had an incredible support from my managers from the moment that I received those messages. They called me, I received incredible messages from colleagues. And so that was something that helped break that cycle of isolation that you feel when you receive targeted messages. You feel like you're alone, you feel a little bit secluded. And so that messaging was very positive for me. And there's also a reassurance that there will be a way of finding methods to counter this. And so that's why I'm very reassured by this conference. I think this is a very positive signaling around how this is not acceptable, and it does have an impact on people. I think it's particularly important to show solidarity among journalists. That was one of the things that made a huge difference for me, is hearing from racialized journalists all across different media, all across the industry, and my colleagues as well within the organization coming forward and telling me that they support me. And as for your second question on, could you remind me what your second question is?
Well, I was asking you about what you would like to see, like in terms of on your mental health and the impact with the managers. Those are the two aspects. But I think you pretty much covered both.
Sure, that sounds good.
Thank you. If I could move to you, Joanna, on those two perspectives, and first maybe how you felt. I know you spoke earlier a little bit about, when your interactions with police. Tristan spoke to that as well. What about within the newsroom, within your bosses? How did that work out? If I could ask you guys all briefly, because I want everybody to get a chance to hear everyone on that.
Yeah, like I mentioned, it was our public editor. So our newspaper has a public editor who asked me, who keeps a file of all the emails I send to him and cases to tell him about. And it was his encouragement and encouragement of my company's in-house lawyer that pushed me to go to the police. Again, I was disappointed by the police reaction, but I do feel it was so worth doing so in case something does happen in the future. At least the local police around me aren't surprised, or they can respond quicker. But it is unfortunate that I need to even think about that. So I've been happy with their support I have in the newsroom. I think many, like Amara said, a lot of racialized journalists in the newsroom have banded together and allies to talk about these issues and make sure it's not something that targets, the main targets among us are suffering alone. I've had colleagues who have done things like offer to take over the Twitter account of someone who's getting a storm of attacks to monitor the messages for possibly threats to report to police. Because something I wanted to point out is that it's very tiring because you can't simply ignore it when hundreds of messages are coming at you, because one of them, might be a doxing attack. It might be a picture of your home. There is like a need to monitor that, and actually something colleagues can do is to take on that burden for someone who is experiencing it, so they don't have to do it themselves. I would also like to point out that some of the death threats I received were in Chinese, or they were in different languages. So my editors did discuss with me that they suspect that some of it might come from out of Canada. Again, I mentioned this police and they weren't able to do anything about it. They don't have capacity to investigate harassment that comes from within Canada, let alone from outside Canada. And it's unfortunate because in my research, I've seen that foreign states have used online harassment to try to stifle criticism all over the world. And that is a well-known and documented phenomenon that happens. So it's unfortunate in Canada. In many countries, we don't have the basic structures to try to investigate what's going on and to identify even when threats are coming from out of Canada.
Wow, thank you for that. Bushra?
Oui, moi je dirais en fait.
I would say that this situation was new for us journalists. It was also new for my boss to face so many harassment and to have to call the police. We were supported.
Je pense qu'avec le temps, peut-être ça va être.
Over time, I hope this is going to turn into a habit, though it was really disrupting for them to take action for the first time.
Mais c'est ça, c'est quand même, je pense que ça a causé quand même beaucoup de stress à
some of my colleagues were really stressed, and I think some of them would have needed to be off for a few days. It is important to be understanding in such situation. If you have received death threats and even to track you after work, it's important to be able to step back a little bit. Especially these harassment can go far, so it's important that we get ready upstream. Tristan, what would you say? The reaction of my managers was great. People were telling me, are you still willing to do the coverage of this topic? Not negligible. I also could recourse to the lawyer in charge of such issues with the press. I could ask him legally, what do you think? Should we push further? It was really helpful. My colleagues also were very quickly aware of what I was being put through. I talked a lot about it. And that does count. I also had conversation with people at Facebook because the insults kept coming onto my account, and then my account was suspended. I could not understand. And some complaints had been filed also. At Facebook, I was said, you have a special status on your account. We could identify that you're a journalist and that the information that you convey is usually true. So it really calmed the things. Unfortunately, there's no official process as of yet, though journalists must be aware that if you identify as a professional journalist, the social media also need to be informed because it can make a difference. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tristan, Omara, Joanna, and Bushra. We almost have set the table for the conversation to take place with the leaders and the managers. But prior to giving them the floor, I would really like to thank you because you were candid, you were authentic and frank. You really know the reality online. If you can help us to find out solution, I know it is complex, but again, your courage and your openness to introduce us to the reality, it helps us moving forward. So thank you very much.
Merci.
So wow, that was really very moving to hear the experience, the Canadian experience. And now we'll have in the Leaders Challenges, have the opportunity to hear what's happening in our newsrooms and how our newsrooms and leaders are dealing with online harassment. So we're already behind time. Without further introduction, let me present to you our participants in the next roundtable. Tout d'abord, François Cardinal, Vice President of Information at La Presse. Wendy, bonjour. Wendy Freeman, President of CTV News. Hello, Wendy. As well as Cheryl McKenzie, Executive Director of News and Current Affairs at APTN, and Ward Smith, Senior Vice President at Global News. As well as Luce Julien, Directrice Générale de l'Information à Radio-Canada. Good afternoon, I still could say, or good morning, depending on where you are, to everybody. Thanks again, and merci.
Thank you very much for being here with us today. I think that we were immediately touched by the testimonies of the journalists and what they face on the field. We could see that the management could react quickly.
I feel like I'd like to start with you, maybe Wendy, if you could speak to us of how did that happen, that the industry was able to move so quickly after the Bernier tweet in September, where the doxing took place? How did that come together?
Could I go first, or?
Yes, Wendy, yeah.
So it's interesting. I had about a week before this had happened, I had started conversations with some of my colleagues from the CBC and Global, et cetera, just because we had seen that this vitriol was getting worse and worse against our journalists. So when this happened that day, that conversation had already begun, and we all reached out and we all agreed that, you know, as we said, solidarity is so important, and attention is a weapon. And this is so important, and we have to call out the instigators. So I got on the phone and I just started calling everyone, and we all agreed that we should get united and do this. And as I said, attention, that's a way to get back, and we have to fight back. So it was great too that everyone did get together, and just this conference today shows us how important this is to fight this.
And that it is an opportunity as well to be able to everybody work together, and we can see that industry is able to do that. And certainly this is an occasion where that it is important.
And we're more powerful together.
Absolutely, 100%.
Maybe we can hear of Luce Julien earlier when Bushra was talking. We could hear the reality where she was with the decryptors. I would like to know about the newsroom. What is the reality as you work in the industry? How did the situation evolve in the newsroom? To start with, Yolande, I would like to thank the reporters and journalists who stood as witnesses, because it is crucial to listen to them. And if we are not aware, we cannot support that. So I find this rather extraordinary to have heard their testimonies. Earlier, when I was listening to them, I was thinking it is absolutely mind-blowing when we talk about the pandemic, which was like a tidal wave, obviously, and the presence on the digital platform. We also feed them with our content. The journalist presence on the social media has also increased. We live in a society where the debate is exacerbated, and our journalists therefore stand as victims, and Bushra was very eloquent on that point. In the Decryptor team, we need to track disinformation. So when we do so, we're really in the eye of the storm. So it triggers anger, different emotions, and of course we become targets. These journalists become targets. It is online that the decryptors have done so. And our field teams on the field, our journalists were targeted during the protest last spring. At a point, our cameraman was saying that I will not do the coverage of this protest because they were directly victims, they were insulted, they were being touched. So we really set briefing stations. We also thought about the type of coverage we would need to do. Do we do direct when we have a 24 hours news channel? So these are all different managers' points. And the safety team, we met several times with our employees as well. Hundreds of employees participated to our information sessions. I think the key word is that we must be aware, we must be informed, and the information must circulate so they can be supported.
I'm doing a link with the presentation we saw this morning, and in a certain way. So these threats, in a certain way, it's to stop journalists to do their work, to try to block the work that needs to happen. So you are in a situation where you have to protect the expression and the freedom of expression, and especially protect journalists, and to join both jobs, which is extremely important. When we're talking about François Cardinal on this question, how do you join the two functions in the today's context? It's hard. What's not? No, it's not an easy question, especially Yolande. That is an angle that we didn't speak about much yet, which was a priority here at La Presse. I'm happy to have heard Tristan before saying that he had the support of his bosses, and it's true. Each case was taken very seriously, but I think at the, when we're talking about what we're forgetting about, the blind spot, that we're looking at the social network threats. I know some journalists in the room, especially women, who no longer go on Twitter, that don't longer go on Facebook because they're tired of the harassment. But it's much harder to, avoid the emails. And every day they go on their iPhones, even Saturday mornings when we're opening our eyes. And I have two examples that are recent, where emails were much more damaging than social media. When I think about my journalists who were covering Le Canadien, you know, as me, that hockey is the hockey is a religion in Quebec. So when we talk about the Stanley Cup, the last round, the comments of the readers were so hard that my journalists were afraid to publish their text the next day. Hockey, talking about hockey, and they became too prudent in their text to fear of receiving so many comments, and emails were like, you're an asshole, you know, suck my, you know, this and that. And so because you said that Canadians were not good, and that was crazy, just the people went just crazy. And so Patrick Lagacé that wrote on the vaccine passport, and they talk about the coordinated attacks. I don't know. We have those much more often in Quebec. And for the Patrick Lagacé's Chronicle, they put my name and my contacts on a blog, and I received 400 emails, almost all the same. But it can become heavy after a while. So the priority at La Presse to see a solution, technological solution for email. So what we did, created boxes that are different. An email address that is circulating on the web that is under the articles. And this box, journalists can decide to go consult it or not. They can consult it at the time where they're ready to take it. Saturday morning, if you're creating an opinion piece very strong, so you may not want to receive on Saturday 300 angry emails, but maybe Monday you're ready to receive them. So the priority in the last year was to manage the emails. I would say that if social media is the new public place, I feel that the emails are the sewers of this public space. It's very interesting to hear you talking about this, because we often have kids say that emails are no longer a thing, but for journalists is a good source of information.
If we could hear from you, Ward, I was thinking about how difficult it is, as Julie and David in their presentation were talking about, and I believe Catherine Tate in her speech as well, how it's so difficult for journalists that a lot of journalists are even leaving the profession. So how are you able to reassure, support in an environment that is extremely, as we've heard from the journalists, extremely difficult to live?
Well, it's tragic, really, what's taking place, and we have witnessed firsthand some of the failings we've had as an organization in supporting our team members. And I don't think that, you know, what we know today is what we knew in 2017 or 2018. The confluence of Trump, the pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, all of this has really put so many people in a fragile and isolated situation. And what we've, you know, always sort of recognized is, you know, consider the source. You know, a lot of these social media organizations treat facts the same as lies. And we know in journalism there is a difference. But when it comes to the frontline people who are receiving these threats, and it's ongoing and it's exacerbated, as everybody's pointed out, it's very disrupting to their work, to their lives, to their mental well-being. And so to say that we care foremost about the well-being and the safety of our employees is one thing. To actually understand what they're facing on a day-to-day basis and come up with concrete action items is something else. And we recognized well over a year ago that so much of our work was embedded with these social media organizations, just the way we set up our businesses. And while it didn't account for a great deal of business, it created a lot of time and concern. So we really moved toward about a year ago a policy of saying, look, you don't have to do this. This is no longer part of your required work. You can if you like, and we'll support you as you do it, but we are not expecting this in your role. We moved links from our webpage, which was driving staff profiles to external social media platforms. Like, why would we do that? It was a simple technical thing to cut that off. We organized and facilitated employee discussions for employees by employees, sharing their concerns and their worries, and this whole idea of talking about it and not feeling isolated was really critical. But it wasn't really enough, to be honest. We moved to move towards social media coordinators, where you could have your content put out there, but not put yourself in direct contact. But moving forward in this, even this past election that we experienced in Canada, and the reporting and the journalism really unleashed even more attacks despite these efforts. And so we, similar to what Francois was talking about, we looked at the email filtering of people and how we can set this up so that people can set parameters and key words. We looked at digital monitoring with software companies like ZeroFox to really profile this. We took it deeper to our legal teams and to our security teams. All of this to say it doesn't always answer the question how our teams are feeling and are we doing enough? And I would argue that we're really just starting to understand what we haven't done well. And so everything like this particular conference today and the learnings that we're having and the sharing of the ideas, where do we take it next to the platforms themselves? How do we actually really put it over there? Because we are, as you all know, so regulated to the point of having a license, that there are responsibilities of publishing and content and fact-based journalism where these organizations don't have that. And so how do we actually get to the point that we can not only, because so many of our people, they like the brand extension of social media, they find the humor, they learn from the news breaking stories, and it really is at times so hard for them to manage this on their own. So our support has to be not only personal and perhaps communicated as often as possible, but really it's about how can we create an environment in which we are heard as news divisions and news organizations and exert the kind of pressure that can lead to meaningful and lasting change for the protection of our journalists.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you speak to how much you're all doing and is how quickly things are moving. So you're trying to keep up and make sure that you're able to protect journalists and that they're able to continue to do their work. You touched on it, so I'm just gonna give you all the opportunity to speak on it. It's probably extremely difficult, but it's been discussed throughout the morning, the platforms. What is their responsibility? How are we as an industry engaging in their responsibility in this discussion? Maybe I will turn to you, Wendy, to speak to that part first.
Well, it's interesting, during COVID, the platforms were very quick to take down anything fake about COVID and the vaccines, yet they're not quick to take down this vitriol that we see. So we need to call them out on that. They're quick to do that, but not to take down this. And as I said earlier, the stronger we are, the more united we are to go after these platforms is really important, and work together to try to take down this stuff. And again, why would they take down this, fake news about COVID, but they don't take down the harassment against our journalists? Someone said to me the other day, well, it's okay to harass journalists. I don't think people understand that it's not okay to harass journalists, because in the end, it chips away at democracy. And as we've said earlier on, people will stop doing stories. They'll stop covering stories because they'll be afraid. I've seen it in this newsroom. I've seen our journalists afraid to cover stories because they know they will be harassed, and this has to stop. And the police and the RCMP and the social media companies have to understand that if journalists can't tell these stories because they're afraid of this harassment, this will chip away at our democracy.
100%. Cheryl, could I hear you on first on your reality and how you feel the responsibility of the platforms that have affected the discussion and our ability to move forward together on this issue?
Yeah, some really great points made by Wendy and Ward. Always find it interesting listening to your experience. For us at APTN, we find like the trolls are really attacking like all Indigenous people as a whole. And that certainly impacts our Indigenous journalists. We talked about journalists who are leaving the profession. Well, we're finding journalists are not even want to come into the profession. So getting more Indigenous journalists at APTN certainly has its challenges. So to see the racism directed at Indigenous peoples as a whole, and then it's directed to the Indigenous media, APTN as a whole, and why do you exist? And you're government funded and we pay our taxes, which is actually not true. We're not government funded media. And then the attacks go on to the content and the people in our stories, the Indigenous people in our stories. So we really have to keep a handle on the comments that are generated on social media. I know other media organizations have moved to closing down the conversation in your stories and in the public comments, because we would always find that, you know, if you're having a good day, don't read the comments, because then you'll be having an even worse day. So we find the attacks against individual journalists really starts as Indigenous peoples as a whole, right. and then it makes their way to Indigenous journalists, and lots of really like highly sexualized content getting through to some of our particularly Indigenous women journalists, which is really troubling. The platforms, yeah, Wendy, that was a great point about them taking down the COVID misinformation around that. But even people who are making anti-colonial statements have found, like, where did their comments go? And multiple people saying, where did my comments go about this certain topic? So it's Indigenous people's comments being taken down, not even journalists. So for us, there's just that added layer of attacking Indigenous people as a whole, and then eventually getting to our individual journalists.
100% in a sense. We were looking back again to this morning's presentation. Indigenous women are at the top of the list in terms of percentage of targeted journalists and doing their work. So as a media company, it is even that much more urgent that we're able to work as an industry on these issues.
I have a question coming from the public, as we say. I will ask you that question, but I think that I can ask that question to everyone, but I will ask it to Luce. We ask strategies that were to protect managers of social media. I think that before we talked about the witnesses, in a way to protect journalists, we say that it would be someone who would be the moderator. So what do we do to protect these managers in that context? I think that on one side, that managers are much less targeted, unless, of course, than the journalists that are working on the field. And I understand, I will want to come back on what Wendy said in terms of solidarity amongst us. But journalist has always been a profession that's hard to practice. When I think about the journalists of investigative journalists that receive the death threats, etc., but today, to cover simply a manifestation or a little contentious issue becomes in some cases perilous. And so Wendy talked about the democracy that is really in cause, because we all lack resources. So as a professional journalist in our work, doing our work becomes even more dangerous than before for our own mental health. I think it's very worrisome, but I think that the conference today is a good step to support our journalists. I will ask the question to François and Medusa. You mentioned it in terms of polarization. How does polarization contributed to this debate? I wanted to hear François on this. So before Yolande, I spoke about my journalists who were covering the hockey that are attacked, but I think it's the fruit of polarization and that anger that's coming from this polarization. So we're living in a period that's very difficult right now. If I go back on the question that you asked before, Yolande, on the responsibility of the platforms, especially in a polarized context, I'm admitting that there's that I feel a type of worry when I hear my colleagues saying that it's the platforms that have to intervene. I have a difficulty to giving this power to the platforms, because sometimes it's the harassment cases that are clear, and I think that yes, the platform has to intervene in a necessity, especially if it's death threats and it's those types of things. But you know, as me, that the limit before the harassment criticism is difficult to limit, and I think that journalists have to continue receiving criticism on the platform. So what I'm trying to give the platforms, do I want to give the responsibility what's published, what's not published, what's harassment, and what is simply a criticism? I want to show a red flag here. I'm going to do a little link with the Donald Trump account that was banished from Twitter. I think that that is a big power that we're giving to a platform to say who can publish, who cannot publish, in the same way that to know what should be published and what should not be. I'm not sure that this type of responsibility that we have as managers, I'm not sure that I want to give it to the Facebooks of this world. So this is a little red flag that I want to, wave, and I'm a little worried about this. I understand.
Did you have that reaction to that in terms of maybe platforms, but then there's also in terms of, if I could add to the mix, public figures who have the doxing, or what is their responsibility in that as well? How do you navigate, as François was talking about, both issues where yes, we want them to take responsibility, but do you want them to be judge and jury at the same time? No.
Thank you for the question. I mean, I feel like some of these platforms benefit from the polarization, from the exaggeration, the piling on. It really doesn't distinguish, fact from fiction. And the more negative eyeballs, somebody once described it as mobilizing the useful idiots to really build their business by having this extremism. And it's almost the exact opposite, I believe, of some of what we do as journalists, and as even the term broadcast. It's to cast a wider net, to find common ground, to sort of build on values that have been established, whether they're right or not, but to have the accountability around it. So we've had, and I'm sure everybody on this call has had experiences where you're dealing with the platform and they do not see it the same way. Their policies are not clear, as somebody once pointed out. There is all the sort of the benefits of influence and power and economy from their audiences, but not necessarily the responsibility and the standards to which we hold ourselves accountable in terms of self-regulation through practices and principles. So somewhere in here, in my mind, it's not evident that they are capable of actually monitoring and responding in a way that would stamp out the extremism and the racism and the hatred. They benefit from it. The actual economy of their business model needs it and feeds off of it. And so this is the distinction in my mind of what we have. But I would argue that, as it was presented earlier, that there are things that we should do and look at their policies, look at the transparency of how they respond, and what is the level of accountability of fact versus fiction, and some of this responsibility of care for people. And that is what is lost. And so how do we exert or influence that in a meaningful way? I think that there's some real challenges here with these platforms and their responses to our requests, and the acknowledgement that there's even a problem in how it disrupts lives and feeds off of some of the frustration and frankly the mental well-being of people. It's not fair.
Wow. We're already out of time, but I have to, since we all have you here, and again, thank you for taking this time. I want to ask you all one last question. I'm going to start with you, Cheryl. As we think to the next part of our forum coming forward, we're thinking about, Not easy issues, not easy solutions. Otherwise, you guys would have all done it. Everybody would have taken care of it together. But we started our conversation talking about how industry was able to work together. But if you had to talk about I won't ask you the one thing, one of the things that you would like to see the industry do together to really move forward on this issue, what would that be, Cheryl?
Well, I think this event certainly helps, and to give journalists in the newsrooms, an opportunity to see that they're not alone, and that we are very concerned about what we can do, and trying to put our heads together about what can be done. Because I find Indigenous journalists in other media organizations like the CTV and CBC and Global, I find they get a lot more trolls than we do at APTN, and I think it just has to do with the the volume of the audience and who's tuning in to those audiences. So it would be good for us to have forums where the journalists can come together to talk a little bit more, and like others have said, bring the conversation more out into the open.
And normalize that conversation. So important to be able to do that and to make sure that everybody feels supported. And again, that's one of the objectives of this forum, so that journalists know that they're not alone and are supported in that. On that note,
unfortunately, on this, it's the only that's all we have for today. So thank you so much for your generosity to have, again, taking the time to talk about your engagement today. And we're going to continue our conversation. I wanted to also thank all our journalists who, were going to share their situations with us. And they even allowed us to record them so we can continue.
I don't know about you, but I'm certainly feeling invigorated by the conversations that we've had already this morning as we look forward.
Absolutely, Yolande, and wow, what a wide-ranging conversation it's been. Thank you, Yolande, for that. The stories I think we heard today were so sobering and so compelling. We're so grateful to everybody who shared their testimonies so bravely. You've reminded us, you and the leaders who shared their insights as well, have reminded us of the importance of normalizing the conversations across the industry and standing together to say that online harassment is not okay. As Yolande said earlier, if you have suffered online, please make sure to talk to someone you trust and use the resources available to you within your organisation. For those in Canada, we're going to share the crisis service numbers on the screen now. For those elsewhere, we'll share resources which might help on the website of the conference. Today's conversation set the scene for next Tuesday's session around how we as an industry can work together to address the threat. And next week, we'll also release the results of an industry-wide Ipsos survey on online harassment against media professionals, the first of its kind in Canada. I'm just going to take 2 minutes now to synthesize what we've heard today, so we can move forward in terms of practical tips and steps as well, I think. So just in terms of what we heard today, I think what we heard was the extent and scale of this, how certain journalists are more impacted by online violence, and specifically those who have been most historically marginalized by the media and by society as well. And also how wide-ranging this is, how it's increased during COVID, and how it's connected to disinformation campaigns and often orchestrated campaigns orchestrated by politicians as well. What stood out, I think, was the fact that it has a real life impact on individuals. We heard about how you turn your phone on in the morning first thing, and you don't have any kind of protective shield around you, and suddenly you're hit by this barrage of abuse. That's incredibly difficult for your mental resilience. But as well as the individuals, it's having an impact on our organizations as journalists as well. And beyond that, as the industry, we heard from David and Julie about the knock-on impact in terms of expression and freedom of expression, and how journalists are leaving our industry, which is horrifying. We're already struggling with media plurality in journalism, and we're losing those who we most need. And that really is really difficult to see happen. And I think one of the things for me that was really interesting, and certainly I know this from my experience, is that how isolating these experiences can be, how often we feel alone, and particularly when we don't have the privilege of support in a kind of obvious way, and how therefore important that that is to have that solidarity. Just very briefly, I'll just a couple of things. If we can remember ahead of next week, you're not alone. You are not alone. You are surrounded by us, and we have solidarity that we've heard here in many different ways today. Voices, it's not acceptable to silence voices. It is acceptable to normalize this conversation. It's not part of your job to have to endure online violence as a journalist. And just briefly, 2 or 3 points in terms of practical points I'd like to mention. I used to run a journalism safety charity. When we sent journalists into war zones, we'd give them flak jackets and we'd give them these bulletproof vests. We'd do risk assessments with them. We'd help them understand the tools they needed to go into war zones. I know that some people feel uncomfortable with this notion that this is a war zone, and I recognize that, but I feel like we've heard from news organizations today that many people are instilling policies and training and resources for journalists to help them understand the risks that they face, to help encourage them to build up an emotional flak jacket, if you want to use that term, which is one that I use to support them. Just 2 more points. Yes to solidarity in terms of holding platforms to account. Absolutely, we need to be holding the platforms really to account, and we can do that much more strongly together. And yes to the fact that any journalists who are experiencing this kind of online harassment, please, I can't reinforce enough how much you're not alone, and how, where possible, let's try to create those spaces both within our small communities and our newsrooms to try to help people feel safer to speak about their experiences. That is a lot of me talking. I'm extremely grateful to all of you for bearing with us, for walking alongside us in this fantastic conversation today. I'm immensely privileged to be part of this. Thank you, Yolande, and I do hope that you will all join us next week to carry on this conversation. Thanks, everybody.